Hello, my name is Wendy Ross. I'm a researcher in creative cognition, in serendipity, and also really interested in possibility studies and the possible. And I'm just here to talk to Vlad Glaveanu about his new book, which is The Possible. Vlad, will you tell us about your book?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for having this conversation with me and also for the interest in the possible and the book. So this book is the product of, I think, about 3 years of work, more conceptual work, but building on a number of years of empirical work and conceptual related to creativity. So the possible, a sociocultural theory, does what it says on the cover. Basically, it proposes a new sociocultural psychological approach of understanding human possibility, how we become aware of, explore, and engage with the possible in our lives. And not only in our individual lives, but also in the classroom, in society, in relation to other people. So what I'm trying to propose here is kind of going beyond or conversing with philosophical debates around possibility and actuality and the work done on possible worlds. There is so much out there on the notion of the possible, but what I'm trying to do is propose a psychological theory of how we become aware of and act on possibility, and the notions of position, perspective, dialogue, all of these become important for me to build up an account of exactly how we do that. And if you want me to summarize, to give an elevator pitch for this
You
book,
stole my
which
question.
I'm challenging myself right now to do that. I think at the end of the day, what it proposes is this notion that our ability to see any issue, problem, other people, ourselves from multiple points of view holds the key to understanding possibility. It's this idea of difference, diversity, and multiplicity that helps us understand that actually ourselves and the world around us, they are open to change and to being different and to being looked at differently. So that is the core message of the book, and I have several examples there from, as I said, many different areas. And I'm particularly excited about this notion of pedagogies of the possible, because it goes into how we can educate and how you can form generations that look towards open futures in the way they learn about the world, rather than constantly reproducing the past, which is for many people the reality of education.
Yeah. And obviously, you've just founded this network of other groups and people that are interested in the possibility and possibility studies. What are your hopes? What do you think would happen within this network? Where do you see us in 4, 5, 6 years' time? What's possible for you?
What is possible for the Possibility Network? So yes, there is the Possibility Studies Network, and also the mere notion of possibility studies is kind of a bold statement, because it is a very emerging type of field, and a lot of colleagues have generously donated their time and energy. Colleagues who work on, I like to call them possibility enhancing or possibility adjacent phenomena, from creativity, innovation, imagination, agency, serendipity, wonder, uncertainty, and these questions, utopia, dystopia, future studies, they really cut across disciplines. They're very interdisciplinary. So we have, first of all, it started as an encyclopedia, the Palgrave Encyclopedia of the Possible, that I'm editing, and you are kindly a senior editor for it as well. And that brought together a community that inspired me, together with other colleagues, to create this a network of networks. So the Possibility Studies Network is an association of centers, labs, programs, groups that deal with anything possibility related. And my hope for it, well, I'm hoping to have interesting conversations, and I think we're achieving this aim right now, perhaps. And then I would love for it to become a platform where people can not only think differently about this topic that is so new, and there is so much that we could say and do with it, but also perhaps to find a way back into the real world to inform some of the debates and questions we're having. Something from education to what we do today with these very fragmented, polarized societies that we live in, can introducing this notion of the possible help us understand things differently, or even do something in the real world that can help. I think that's really a wonderful aim I would love to work towards.
Okay. So Vlad, tell me then, why the possible? Why is the possible so important to you?
Oh, that's a question I've been asking myself for a number of years now, Wendy. Actually, it all started with me working on creativity, for more than a decade, and advancing these very social and cultural understanding of creativity. And after I tried to have this 360-degree view of what it means to create in society with other people, with material tools, I got to think more and more about why I actually chose creativity in the first place. And what emerged to me was this idea, or what emerged for me was this idea that we are beings that live these kind of amphibious lives. We live both in the here and now of our experience, but also have this amazing capacity, which is very much cultural, by the way, and we can talk more about that, to engage with what is not here, what we bring back from our past, from our constructed past, not necessarily the past as it was, what we imagine towards the future, and also the alternatives that we create. And what fascinated me about creativity was precisely this very human. I mean, I don't want to sound as if I'm a speciesist, right? I'm not trying to put ourselves on top. I do appreciate that perhaps, most certainly there are many other beings in the natural world who are, on the way in the case of this capacity, and they can do amazing things in terms of imagining things that are not there. But human beings, I think we excel at that. This is what defines us as a species. So this was fascinating for me from the very beginning. And then I thought about the context of today. I've been starting to work on the possible for, I think, about 4 years now. And the world was not in a bad state as it is today, but it was certainly going towards the direction. And it seems like we live in a moment in which we're quite disempowered. And I wanted to recover something of the meaning of human agency and what it means to be an agent in our own lives. And I think reflecting on the possible can help you with that. Yeah.
Okay, so for you, the possible is a sort of almost an emancipatory type concept. So it can help us to move beyond where we are now.
Right. I mean, I don't want to be too normative, and I definitely don't want to be over romantic about it. I feel like if you take a very concrete situation, like, going to the supermarket when we could go to a supermarket, pre-pandemic, if you are faced with a shelf full of all the products in the world, you might be paralyzed. You won't know what to choose if you have 100 varieties of breakfast cereals, right? So there are ways in which, when we're faced with too much possibility, we get stuck, we get anxious, we get annoyed. So I feel like there is an optimum, in a way, of we live lives of constrained possibility, and that's what makes it, that's actually giving the possible its value, that it's not everything goes, and it's not you can do anything with anything else, right? So coming back to what you said about emancipation, I think it can definitely be used like that. Now, whether it is for good purposes or bad purposes, there is a broader discussion to have there. And I don't feel, well, I feel like meaningful lives are those lives that cultivate possibility, even at the most micro scale. So I in that sense, yes, I do see a positive value, in talking about it.
I'm going to just pick up on something you said there, only because I'm being cheeky and taking through some of my own thoughts about the constraints and the possible. Because I'm still trying to frame some of the ideas I have about what makes an accident a serendipitous accident or a non-serendipitous accident. And to some extent, it's about the association between the existing sort of theoretical or epistemic state and then what is sort of around it. So this adjacent possible. And I think that's quite interesting in terms of what you were saying then about the possible constraints and that you can't be too. There's sort of this dissipation. There can be conceptual dissipation almost, where everything's possible and anything's possible, then it doesn't really mean anything anymore. Do you think something as big and as broad as the possible could end up being at risk of that, really, where it's just, well, anything that's not here and now is possible?
Well, I'm gonna go back to creativity to kind of give this cautionary tale, right, about the notions we use and how we use them. So it really depends on what you put in the concept. So for instance, with creativity, to give this other example, it has become over the years and decades actually a very individualistic term, and a lot of people cannot get away from this assumption. When you talk about creativity, you talk about the person, the capacity of the person to express herself or himself, and that's why if you look at another literature that interests me a lot, which is social change, there is so much that theories of creativity could give to people who look at social change. And yet the word creativity is never there. as far as I know, it's never been used. People don't think about that. And the reason is precisely because they think, well, that's a very individual category. So without falling in the same trap, I think the trap with the possible would be to juxtapose it or kind of contrapose it really to the real and what actually is there, and create this very false dichotomy between what is and what is not there, and think that the possible is only airy-fairy fantasies and everything that is, beyond the here and now. And what I would like to recover with this conception of the possible is actually the tension and dialogue between what is and not what is not here. And I think serendipity is an amazing case in point, where, as you said, it's almost like a Vygotskian zone of proximal development. You have to build on something present and at the same time be open enough to bring in something else from your experience. And it's that connection that could, lead to a serendipitous moment. But you would know, you're not better than I do.
I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out it. But that's what I found interesting, because a lot of these concepts, you start to come across them, and there's a moment when things are clearly close enough, and then a moment where they're too far. And this sort of in between moment, and I think that's true of creativity as well, because obviously creativity is rooted within a social cultural background and context. And to be accepted as creative, it has to speak to somebody within that context. But then equally, if it's too similar, then it's not creative, because it's not novel. But if it's too novel, then it can't be assimilated in any way into that sort of context. And then when you were talking again about possibility, about you need to have a sort of constraint on possibility, that you can't just, this idea that everything is going to work.
Exactly.
It sort of seems a lot of these big concepts seem to have that sort of that strange tension between between an extreme version which just doesn't work.
Yes.
And so that
and a more and a more, I wouldn't call it a tame version as much as a kind of balanced and more kind of holistic view, in which you try to keep these things in equilibrium and don't go, don't have this excessive view of one or the other. And I think for me, what's really interesting, and I would love to discuss with you, is this idea of difference and possibility, because I've been mentioning that, okay, we need to move the debate from what is real and what is possible to understanding what is possible, essentially, and from a very human point of view, by the way. I'm not talking here about geological possibilities and the birth of the universe. I mean, the possible can be seen in so many different ways, in the natural sciences, from a philosophical perspective. Myself, I'm a psychologist. So I'm very interested in our experience. When does the possible and the feeling that something is possible emerge, And the answer I've been kind of building on is that the possible emerges whenever there is a difference between at least two different points of view that are coming together, because that means that there are at least two ways to understand something, to look at it, to act on it, and that creates a space. I mean, it's a bit geometrical, right? If you have only one point, that's kind of a monism, that's a unity. You can't really break away from it. But the moment you have two, you can draw a line, and if you have three, you can make a triangle. So then you see the space around a point. In a way, almost excludes the space around it. You just focus on it. But the moment you have this duality or plurality, you get to understand the world as multiple. And I think that's when the subjective, the phenomenological idea of possibility, that's where it comes in.
With the tension between what I thought was useful, and I know we've discussed this in other times as well, within your book, was the way that you are very clear that there's a difference between a multiple perspectives that you're talking about here and a very cultural relativism in which everything goes. And we've seen really recently the dangers of that idea that truth is relative, or that all perspectives are sort of equal, have an equal validity. I didn't know if you wanted to push that a little bit further and think about.
I think here exactly we go back to what is a perspective, because a lot of people talk about perspectives, and you can do it in very psychological, cognitive ways. And a lot of the literature on perspective taking, traditionally is about that. Can I construct a mental representation of what you are thinking about at this moment? Or can I construct a mental representation of the object you're looking at, and so on and so forth? But I think from a pragmatist point of view, which, is my preferred philosophy, there is something about living in the world and acting on the world that shapes and forges this perspective. So for me, perspectives are in a tradition of George Herbert Mead and Alex Gillespie and Jack Martin and other neo-median scholars, it's really an action orientation. So you don't have to act on every perspective, but what it means is that it gives you a pathway of relating to the world in a certain way. So, you know, if we take on a concrete example, I don't know, about a water bottle, because I have it here in the on my desk. So, you know, this is conventionally, it's a container of liquid, you know, whatever liquid the person wants. But then if you sign it, maybe you can turn it into a work of art, as in the found objects kind of tradition of art. So these are such radically different perspectives. And I believe that when people are presented with such radical difference, they get to understand that something else can exist even beyond these two perspectives. For me, possibility relates a lot to this kind of what else thinking. You know, we talk a lot in psychology about what if thinking and as if thinking, which are obviously crucially important, but possibility is a lot about what else thinking. And when you start thinking, what else is out there? How else can I understand this? How else can I relate to this? Yeah, I think that's when you really engage with the possible. Now, again, we come back, you know, does it mean that everything you imagine is real? Well, real. It's true in that conventional way, you know, with the post-truth kind of society. Of course, if you look at perspectives as rooted in action, you have to understand the consequences of this action. I follow, again, quite a pragmatist notion of truth that departs a little bit from very classical correspondence theory. You know, your perspective is true only when it completely represents what is out there in the world, because I want to break a little bit from this very sharp dichotomies between what is in the world and you know, what is in the mind. But what I do accept, and it's very obvious to me, is that because we're human beings who engage in joint action, our perspectives will have to clash with each other within the course of that action, and they will have consequences. So when you peddle all sorts of conspiracy theories, those are perspectives, but there are consequences when meeting the shared reality of all our actions and perspectives will be quite dangerous. So there is of course a big scope to discredit certain perspectives and to say, you know, they shouldn't be part of this dialogue of possibility, that they're actually harmful. I think we should leave a space for that. Absolutely.
And how would you assess whether they're harmful or not, if you've sort of got this lack of this moving away from a correspondence theory? So how
Right.
would it just be from the action outcomes and what that might lead to?
Right. Well, you see, outcomes are also a bit problematic, because the question is for whom and when. You know, it can be short term, it can be medium term, long term, and so on. But I do believe, yes, that there is something about the kind of, you know, what does this depiction of the world that my perspective is creating generate for myself, for other people, for the environment. You know, we can think in broader, more systemic terms. And I think there is a big literature on wisdom, by the way, that tries to exactly do this exercise with people. What is the impact? And I think, I mean, I might be a bit, again, romantic here, but I do think that when that perspective is so obviously and blatantly harmful for other people, it's actually harmful for the self as well. Because, you know, when you look at this self-other dynamic, which is so essential for the possible, you know, you need different points of view to be in tension. If you build perspectives that deny the perspective of the other, if you build perspectives that obliterate the point of view of the other completely, you're missing exactly this openness that,
You
you know,
haven't got
makes
the
the possible
plurality of
possible.
perspectives. You've just got
Exactly.
yes. So
Exactly.
you're pulling away from that plurality. You're pulling away from the
Yeah.
possible and
Yeah.
narrowing it
Yeah.
down. And maybe some of the perspectives that we see, or
Mm.
the positions we see taken, are doing exactly that. They're trying desperately
Right.
hard on either side of the political spectrum to
Right.
squash
Right.
plurality of perspective, and to quash the possible then by breaking down any
Yeah.
dissent, really, I suppose.
Right. I mean, I also think that I talked about we can dismiss certain perspectives, which means that, you know, we don't have to agree with every perspective. I think that's another big error that people who accuse sometimes, you know, pragmatists or people who talk about perspectives of pure relativism, is that it's not everything goes, but we do have responsibility to try to understand where people are coming from in the way they build those perspectives. So I feel that is an ethical kind of approach to society, to the way we exist, and to how we are as human beings, which doesn't mean that you shouldn't have, once you've considered, you cannot dismiss or argue against something. Another big inspiration for me is Bakhtin, the philosopher of language and psychologist in some ways for some people, and literary critic. And he talked a lot about tension and conflict. And I think that's really essential, that we, as we understand perspectives, we should not live in a la-la world of let's all share, let's all come together, let's share the same perspectives. The value of it is exactly the tension. And conflict can be very productive for possibility, because it opens some doors, but it closes some doors, but it also opens many others. So I think there is something there about not agreeing with all perspectives, but trying to understand and valuing the fact that multiple perspectives are possible. I think that's the
And I
key
think it's one of the things that struck me one of the first times I heard you speak, where I think you might have borrowed it or you invented it yourself, about the smoothie fruit salad metaphor. And it's something that struck me again reading your book, is sometimes when you walk yourself through some of the sort of distributed cognition literature or the embodied cognition literature, there becomes a loss of boundaries. It's almost like every single boundary, we see a boundary, we see a binary, we're going to break it, and the self dissipates across materials, across people, across cultures, and knowledge, everything sort of gets spread out. And sometimes that will erase all this difference in a way. And that's something that I find sometimes difficult myself, because I sometimes think, well, actually there are you can see differences in boundaries, even if they're hard. I think they're hard to grasp, because the second you try to balance them too much, they do sort of disappear. But yes, that's one of the things that I thought was really interesting, was that sustaining this difference seems to be important to your view of the possible, as opposed to what one might think, which is sort of removing the difference. Actually, for you, the difference is really important. Do you think that's
right? Absolutely. But I think, you mentioned distributed cognition, and it's a field that I've enjoyed interacting with and engaging with myself. And in a sociocultural tradition, you have to kind of really acknowledge the work done by people who come from a different perspective and yet arrive at quite similar conclusions. And I agree that in my work on creativity, I've been arguing quite strongly about cutting across the Cartesian divide, right? And not being so, not putting these very firm boundaries between what is symbolic and material, what is self and other, and so on. But I think what matters here is how we look at these differences. I've been giving a bit of thought to this question. And, if you look at these as very ontologically instituted, and therefore, they kind of, if you accept the difference, basically you create these very multiple realities, versus if you look at these differences as coexisting and co-evolving. I think that's the second kind of perspective that I would like to bring forward with this, not as these rigid boundaries, but as flexible and moving boundaries. The way self and other are very, very much co-evolving dynamic systems. So I feel in distributed cognition, you have these ontological divides, and there is often this question of where does the mind end? That is, people are looking for that ultimate boundary. Okay, it's not the tip of your fingers or the skin. Maybe it's the stick you use, but maybe it's beyond the stick. But where exactly? Is it like a yard, 2 yards in front, or something like that? And I feel that is a wrong way, for me personally, of asking the question, because it reifies the boundary. And working with more dynamic boundaries still respects differences while not making them absolute. So maybe that would be
I think that's one of the things that in terms of trying to look at anything that's happened, it happens also not just on a sort of temporal scale as well. So you can look at, I've been thinking a lot at the moment about the relationship between insight and creativity, because they're constantly collapsed as being the same thing, but they're not the same thing. We know they're not the same thing, because a creative act can happen over years and years and years. You think about the writing of some of the great novels, they don't happen in a moment of insight. Instead, there might be multiple insights, and it expands over years and years. But insight is still something that happens. It's still something that we can generate. It's still something that we can elicit within the lab. And it's all right for a concept such as creativity to have these different timescales existing within it. And it's all right for your question. If your question is, how is a work of art produced? That's entirely different to what happens when we have that moment of sort of excitement or that moment of insight. And I think that plurality of time and of boundaries is
Mhm.
really important, because
Right.
otherwise, like exactly like you said, you can find yourself chasing, and I certainly found myself guilty of it, chasing the right level of analysis and be constantly sort of chasing, okay, so right, so this might be important. And once you do that, there's always something you can
Mm.
bring. The thresholds don't work because there's always something different
Right.
aside that you can bring in, right? You go, okay, so yeah, so this is my, but oh yeah, but in that instance, this one thing, and then before you know it,
Mhm.
you've spread out beyond
Right.
where you want to be. So I really like this
Exactly.
idea of plurality being all right, and things being ontologically unstable,
Mm.
and
Mm.
us
Exactly.
actually
Yeah.
just be comfortable with instability, because
Yeah.
really that's what it's about, isn't it? It's about
Mhm.
forming and reforming in a constant sort of dynamic shift.
Yeah, it's a very developmental perspective in a way. Exactly. I love this idea of ontological instability. And, to borrow a Vygotskian phrase, I think it's if you want to understand something, you have to look at it develop. And this is how we should look at insight or serendipity or possibility in across time, really, in different scales of time, not just and definitely moment to moment, which is something that I know you worked on, these microgenetic moments, right, of serendipity. So
But
yeah.
you can also have moments to moments, but whilst fully respecting that that moment is not the whole story.
Mhm.
I think
Right. Right.
this is about the plurality, right? So you're like, okay, so I know that everything I do is situated, and it's situated within my life story, within the life story of the people around me, within the life situation, and then within the wider thing of what's happening in society, and then wider, not just what's happening today, but what's happened just all of these things come into play in every single action you do. But sometimes once you become aware of that, it can be quite paralyzing, because
Mm.
at what point do I say, if you're talking about an action that you're making or something you've done,
Yeah.
how do I even begin to talk about that? Do I need to talk about, have I done that as a woman? Have I done that as a woman in the 20th century? Have I done it as a woman living in the pandemic? Have I done it as a you have multiple roles, multiple perspectives. So I think it's being comfortable with knowing that you can't do it all,
Yeah.
which is what this plurality that you're talking about really, really appeals to me from that perspective. It's okay, so
Mm.
there's
Mm.
loads of different ways
Yeah.
we can look at this, but we can't actually look at it all. So, but it doesn't.
Right. Right.
One
And
way is it doesn't. So
yeah.
if I'm really interested in the micro scale, that's my favorite thing.
Mhm.
If I could just look at second by second behavior, I'd be happy.
Right.
But I don't think that tells me anything about what's happening on a broader scale. But that's all right, because I don't think the broader scale people say anything about what's happening on a micro scale.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Well, I think here it's also interesting to look at how, I often love adopting these very social perspectives, and I often ask myself, okay, but where are other people, in different models that we propose and conceptualize. And I'm thinking here with possibility, yes, we have a multitude of positions and perspectives and points of view, but they're also constrained by the fact that other people, in your vicinity, people you interact with, come with their positions, points of view, and perspectives. And that makes it interesting. And as you said, something that in a moment A, you have this horizon of possibility due to this kind of identification and positioning of yourself, can immediately change to moment B depending on exactly who you are interacting with. And I think here there is a big part, and I know you're so interested in materiality, and so am I. So a big way of thinking about kind of material actors and how they come into play to reposition us, to force us to adopt a new perspective, and therefore again contribute to this horizon of possibility. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting how hard it is for us to, as psychologists, or how hard, not maybe not for us, but for lots of
Mm.
psychologists, to accept that sort of that level of material engagement, and that level of the fact that we're structured as well with the things around us, which can increase and really constrain possibly as well, because of what you were
Mm.
talking earlier about the very human nature of possibility. When you're then with things that don't have that, they don't have that potential in the same way, because there is some level of fixedness. I'm thinking about an architect friend that I have,
Uh-huh.
and the work that he does on buildings, and the possible in buildings, and at some point the building stops, and it evolves a
Mm.
little bit, but it evolves only with people, and the people co-evolve with it. But at
Right.
some point you've put the final brick down, you've put the
Right.
and so what's evolving is different, because what's evolving is
Mm.
not the fixed building anymore. It's a people system, a people building system, and a neighborhood building system.
Right.
And there's something as well about that sort of that static nature of some form of materiality. that I think then constrains some of our possibles in a way that, because people are more fluid, possibly doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, materials do change in and of themselves across time. Like that building would become a bit more old and need renovation, and some accidents might happen that change its facade and so on. And some would be more lucky accidents that people look at them and think, wow, that's actually nicer this way. But it does require exactly this kind of interaction and dialogue between the person and the material. I mean, it's in neither all of these things that are emerging. It's through the relationship, and that's what attracts me towards perspectives, that they are a very relational notion. So a perspective is basically a bridge between a certain position in the world that you can conceptualize in many different ways, in physical terms, in more psychological terms, a position of a victim, for instance, in legal terms, in very social terms, and so on, and the aboutness of the perspective, which can be a building, can be a problem that you solve, can be yourself, that is your topic of reflection. So yeah, it has a lot of but at the end of the day, it is that interaction. Exactly.
And happening in that in-between space, so it doesn't, and the in-between is the coolest space. That's where I think I want to end up living, if I could choose somewhere.
But I think we are already.
Everything seems to happen there, right? It's like the place to be. So given, and this is something that I know that we're both interested in anyway, do you think you can increase people's responsiveness to the possible? Do you think you can induce a state of sort of possibility thinking? Do you think that's something that's possible?
Right. Yes, that's a big question that I'm kind of working on, including with you, and I'm very happy to kind of explore this question with you, because I feel like, just like with creativity and many notions, there are different levels at which we can talk about possibility. In my book on the possible, I adopted a very kind of basic ontological point of view of how we live in the world and what it means to be a social and cultural being, and to live in a world of difference and diversity of positions and perspectives. So in that sense, we already live as beings of the possible and within societies of the possible, a notion we can discuss further. But that doesn't mean, so that there is that view that is more general and ontological, but then we need to think about the possible in very contextual terms as well. We can't just have this more general discussion. And there, I think it's a responsibility of us as psychologists, educators, whatever profession we might have, or even as human beings, to think about how we build situations that either expand or restrict our possibility, the possibility of other people, and so on and so forth. And possibility thinking, for me, I mean, this is a notion that a lot of people, from late Professor Anna Kraft to her colleagues and so on, a lot of people talk about it in educational settings, in a much more concrete and wonderful way, actually, when you think about the way they talk about play and as if thinking and embodied, explorations and so on. But for me, I'm thinking of it as a mode of thought, a bit similar to that system 1, system 2 automatic control thinking type of division, whereby phenomenologically you get into a different state of mind and a different way of being when you start playing with possibilities. And I think it's an experience we all had. I mean, if you think about daydreaming, if you think about, I don't know, wondering about things, it really takes you a bit away from the immediate and puts you in a different state of mind. What I'm curious about is how we can trigger that, that being in that other state of mind, and what does it do to us at so many levels, at an individual level, at the level of our own identity and self-understanding in relation to other people. Does it open us up to them, or does it close us down, in relation to society? Does it encourage us to have a more complex systemic view of social problems, or maybe not? So these are all empirical questions. My preferred idea, or my preferred hypothesis, would be that indeed, the more we engage in possibility thinking, the more we open ourselves up to the world. And there is a counter hypothesis there, that the more you do that, the more you live within your own mind. But the proposition I've made in the book is that actually possibility is not separate from actuality, and therefore it anchors us even further in the world. So that's a very interesting, both philosophical and empirical topic, I think, to explore.
I really like the idea of this third sort of thinking, and I like it a lot because it actually it's always think of sort of system one thinking as being sort of irrational, and system two thinking as being rational, but all linked within rationality. So so they have a perspective on rationality. One is what the thing you should do. One is the thing that you're going or fasting, and you're all thinking about something. There's a target, and so there's still this directed nature of it, even if the process. And I mean, I find anyway, anything that the idea that we can have these undirected things is so important, but so missing from a lot of our theories. And so this possibility thinking feels like it's initially an undirected thinking. So you're not trying to, it's not so, well, I mean, correct me, but my idea would be that it's not that you're trying to solve, you're not engaging in possibility thinking because you're trying to solve a problem specifically, but actually just engaging in it as a mode of thinking in itself. So and in doing so, other things might come out of it.
Yeah, I mean, it could be part of problem solving, obviously, but it's not directed by the same constraints of focusing on what is the case, where do I need to get to, definitely. So it gives us this freedom and flexibility to reimagine the situation, reimagine the world. And, it's so funny to think that we both have it in every single moment of our lives. And, when we play with the idea of what we're going to make for dinner, there is an instance of possibility thinking. So it's so pervasive, but at the same time, it's so rare. It's so rare that we fully allow ourselves that freedom. So I guess we can think of it on a continuum perhaps as well, where there are moments in which we have these very blended experiences of possibility and actuality, that anchor us in what is. And then you have these mini moments of kind of exploring possibility. And then when you allow yourself, and usually it's when we're struck by certain kind of insights and life events and circumstances, when we just, we go full on and embark on these imaginations of what could be and so on. And I'm interested in both of these. But I think if we found a way to trigger the second one, that is a deeper, more transformative experience, we would learn something basic that then we can come back and understand the everyday kind of more micro ways of engaging in that. So one goal would be, how do you help people wonder about things, And I'm going to give a concrete example because maybe if anyone's listening, maybe they're thinking, okay, but what does it mean in practice? So for instance, one example of how you make people be aware of possibilities, to take something very common and everyday, and then have a completely different angle on it that kind of destabilizes, defamiliarizes that object for you. So in that moment, that object becomes ontologically unstable, speaking of, using the same word. So it becomes plural, and you rarely thought about it that way, but the umbrella is much more than umbrella. It can be something to pot for flowers, if you put earth on it, in it, and flowers and so on. So what does that mean to you in that moment? How does that feel? What does it make you think about, and what does it make you do? I think that's very important from that angle.
And I just love it because it is this counter to cognitive models of linearity, of purposefulness, because and it may change, and it may it may have a sort of something like sort of an exactative, sort of changing purpose as it goes. But just the idea that you can have a form of thinking that doesn't have to have an end goal, doesn't have to necessarily fit into an algorithm. And it's interesting, I think you've used a couple of times, you've used the word play. And we know how important play is, but play has no end goal, it has no purpose. We're not play that children engage in. And I think play is probably quite important as well to some of these ideas that you're talking about. Do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the studies of play are one of the first examples of why this is a mode of thought. Again, going back to Vygotsky, who said many wonderful things, but I recall that he talked about play and children in play, and I would extend it to adults, obviously, as being a head taller than themselves. So it's this idea that, and it has been demonstrated by a lot of further empirical research on play, that children can do and think in much more complex ways the moment you put them in that as if, what if, playful situation, rather than, if you present them with a mathematical problem that it can be quite complex, if you give it as a problem that they have to pay attention to and be a proper student working on it, they're going to solve it at a lower level than if you were just making a game out of it. They might come with amazingly new ideas just because they allow themselves to be in that more non-directed or kind of directed towards alternatives. That's really one other way of looking at it. And these alternatives are more open-ended than linear models, definitely.
That's fantastic. That's super inspirational. Thank you very much, Vlad. Thank you for your time. And yeah, I look forward to talking to you soon.
Excellent. Thank you, Wendy. And I'm hoping that we're going to have more conversations with very interesting people who work on this kind of
I'm excited about all the different people we've got lined up. I think it's going to be really, really interesting.
Excellent. Thank you again.
Thank you. Bye.